was starvation. In 1941, just at the beginning of the German occupation, most people had enough food stashed away, not because they were so prudent planners, but because under the Soviet system, if there was something available, you take it. Because chances are, in another month or so, it won't be available. So whenever there was sugar or flour or something available, they would store it. And just about every household had accumulated a certain amount of food that lasted until the beginning of winter. But then it ran out. Then opportunists come in. The farmers, the black marketeers coming into the ghetto areas with potatoes and flour and sugar and bartering, exchanging a diamond ring for a sack of potatoes or, a piano. A piano for a sack of potatoes. So, but, the middle class, the people that had some means to live by before had accumulated enough to maybe be able to barter. But the poor people didn't have anything. And they started dying of starvation. 1941, the beginning of 1942, bad winter. Every morning as I would go to work, I would pass a number of bodies on the street. Every day they would collect 10, 15, 20 bodies.
How did it affect you to see dead people?
Terrible. Terrible. The first shocker was to see my grandfather and grandmother dead. Before then, I never saw a dead person, a dead body. Then, going out, you see a man, a beard, a blue face, eyes popped out, and it was, shocking. But then in another week or so, I'm getting used to it. And you see children with their bellies like this. It was heartbreaking, but what can you do? So that winter was a bad winter. And several hundred people died of starvation. Now, you're starting out with a Jewish population of 15,000. By the time you go through that action number 1, and the pogrom, and the starvation, and by the time you add up all the victims of that, by the beginning of 1942, there are probably 2,000 gone, or maybe more than 2,000 gone. But then, action number 2, action number 3, action number 4. Every 4 to 6 weeks, a same basic system. They come in the middle of the night, they surround an area, they take people out, but at this point they just assemble them, take them to a train and deport them. No longer individual executions. We didn't know where they were being taken. Not until later did we find out how these transports were dispatched and where they are going. each one resulting in a 500, 600, 700 victims. And by the end of the middle of 1942, the population is shrunk to a point where they can consolidate the two ghettos into one ghetto. So the one on the east side of town was disbanded, and everybody is now moving to the one in the center of town, Debre. The ghetto in Debre started out with something like 8,000 people. So that means that maybe half of the population was already disposed of. Same modus operandi. As a matter of fact, the question was not whether there will be, but when there will be the next one. And we learned to keep our ears open, because they would use the same troops, the same special battalions. And they would move from one city to the next city. This was their job. And they would move in a pattern from north to south. And usually Borislav would find itself, since we are the extreme south, we would find itself toward the end of the line. So we would hear about things happening in Sambor and in Stri and Drahobic and in Przemyśl. Okay? So we knew it's coming. They're coming closer, so it's coming. But what do you do about it, other than try to hide?
Did you know any of the Jewish police or the Judenrat or any of the authority people?
Yes, I did. I had some friends, neighbors who were in the Jewish police. I knew the man who was in charge of the Judenrat, Mr. Goldman. He was a family friend. Koretz, another one. None of them alive anymore. But their authority was really directed one way: to act on behalf of the Germans against the Jews, not the other way around. Okay? So whenever the German army requested more sweaters or coats or furs, there was another drive, to collect these things.
What was your opinion about these people who were placed in that kind of a very conflicting position?
I wasn't mature enough to ask the question, okay? But I know that my uncle, for example, did ask the question. He said they have no recourse. There's nothing they can do. That it's because they were known to be among the leaders of the Jewish community by previous activities, either because of industry association or social work or whatever, they were simply drafted into that position and they had no recourse. Like with every instance of power, it plays tricks on people who are given that power. And in the case of a couple of the Jewish policemen, it became evident that they are now acting not involuntarily in this. And, you know, so you started be watchful of these, knowing that they may actually harm you not because of their job, but because they like it.
Are there any names that you would care to mention?
Well, the one that was notorious was the commandant of the Jewish police, Eisenstein. And, you know, he was in charge of the Jewish police for, I guess, since the middle of 1942 until the liquidation of the camp in 44. And he had a very bad reputation. You know, he was almost hated as much as the Germans. And in the end, it didn't help him. He was he was evicted like the rest and transported to Plaszow. And in Plaszow he was killed by the inmates of the camp as they were unloading the train. So they did get to him.
How did you hear about that event?
From people who survived. There were some Borislav people who did go the full route through Plaszow and into Auschwitz and survived, because it was pretty late in the war now. It was middle of 44. So we're still in the middle of 1942. We are now liquidating the one ghetto and just operating with one remaining. There comes, I told you that we were working in a field outside the city, digging ditches, preparing for a new oil well to be erected in the Murajnica region. And one day in August, everything happens in August. One day in August, we got surrounded, as we were working, we got surrounded by 4 or 5 mounted Schutzpolizei, Reiterzug, German police. And they just gathered us all in a group and let's go. Form a little group, and they escort us to the main road. This was at least 7 miles south of the city. So they get us on the road and they start marching north. And as we march north from other feeder points, there come groups like ours, surrounded by other Germans and Ukrainians. And before you know, we are forming a column. And before we know, as we get to the southern part of the city, we are like 300 strong or so. And it dawned on us that this exemption that we thought we had, we probably don't have, because we are in the middle of action number 5. Action number 5. So we are now being led to the railroad depot, joined by several hundred others. And by the time we get there, we are placed in a warehouse, at the railroad yards. And by then, there were already maybe 300 or 400 people in there. And then we are coming in. By the end of the day, it was several hundred people in the warehouse, which was maybe 30,000 square feet or something like that, with a one half of it designated to all the prisoners, and one half to the 3 or 4 German and Ukrainian guards watching over, and pushing against the wall. It's getting hotter. It's August, and there is no water, and there are no sanitary facilities, and things are getting very uncomfortable. The night is very restless. Next morning, more people are brought in, and by the middle of the next day, they're beginning to die, either of thirst or exposure or something. By the afternoon of the second day, the Jewish police comes in with a field kitchen with something resembling soup and some bread, and they start distributing this to the people. Mayhem, screams, fights, terrible. By the evening of that day, the second day, things are really coming to a summit of discomfort and fear, but still there's no attempt made to break out or anything like that. The Germans come in with some dogs to help keep the order. The Jewish police is remaining in place to help keep the order. And they bring trickles of some additional people in, but I think they now have the transport, essentially, the quota. They each operate on quotas. And the next day, the train is supposed to take us away. The next day, the train, indeed, the train came. Now, as we were in process of, trying to find some kind of solution to something, each one individually, I kept on my feet and I kept walking around as much as I could, working through the crowd, and I noticed that Eisenstein from the Jewish police notices me. He knew me because his son was a pupil of mine in math. So he kind of winked at me, and when I got closer to him, he said, "Stay close to me if you can." Later that afternoon, the train arrived, and by sunset, they started loading the cars. There were, I imagine, about 10 or 12 cars, each one with to hold 90 to 100 people. And as they were pushing us into the cars, I tried to stay close to the door as much as I could. And when they finally started closing the doors, it was getting dark already, as the door was rolling close, I jumped out right into the arms of Eisenstein, who quickly took me in and pushed me into the group of the Jewish policemen, who were at that point already getting together to move back to their headquarters. And so I joined them, and we went back to the Jewish police station. I stayed there until the next day when the action was over. And once the action is over, it's a new chapter, so you go back to work. That was about 1,000 people. And I was about as close as I would ever get to ending up in wherever that transport went. I don't know exactly where it went, but the choices were just few. It was Treblinka or Sobibor, or Auschwitz was getting popular at that time. So, middle 92, a few new things. They started construction on or reconstruction, refurbishing an old barracks of the Polish cavalry, small detachment of the Polish cavalry that was kept there for ceremonial purposes primarily, for parades and the like. You never saw them once the war started. They started building what they represented to be a labor camp for the specialists and particularly skillful workers in the oil industry. And there will be room for 2,000 in that. And they will start by selecting the 2,000 from the present, from the present working groups, and they would issue these special badges with a letter R on it, with a number, and this was our passport to life.
What did the R stand for?
Rüstung industry, which means defense industry. So this was one meaningful thing. Of course, the ghetto was still close to 8,000 people, and if they take 2,000 in the camp, that still leaves 6,000 that are there with a death warrant on them. But nothing could be done. They tried to find some work for them. They got more and more active in trying to find hiding places. And by then, we already heard about Warsaw. The Warsaw Ghetto, the uprising. I'm talking about 43 now. I finished 42 with action number 5. There was one more thing happened between then and 43. So I'll come back to it, but the preparations for the camp started, in fact, around 42, and they started giving us those badges. But the ghetto still continues. In 1943, beginning of 43, Stalingrad